Welcome to those online. Apologies, few more minutes. We'll get there soon.
Much better. So this is now completely wrong, but we'll not worry about that right now. So I'm Adam Valsmer from JISC. I am one part of the presenting team. Just trying to finish getting laptops out of and is Jenny Evans from the University of Westminster. So we put this session together on the back of a meetup that we had at the virtual session on the different ways that we look at the outputs from research that are not articles, basically, on the way that we capture, present, and do all of those special fair things when we don't have a PDF, we're not an article. That may be part of it, but there's a much wider ecosystem of research outputs. So the idea behind this session was I'm going to just move this because I can't actually see my slides currently. So I'm in Zoom. Stop that. Okay, do that. There we go. Right. So sorry, back. There we go. So these 4 bullets are kind of like the main kind of philosophical basis for this, right? So we have the creative and performing arts communities generating diverse research outputs. We have performances, we have compositions, we have a large set of things which are in some ways process-based and in some ways more complex than just the articles that we end up quite often using. So those non-traditional outputs need an equal recognition, equal way of being captured, having proper metadata created about them, and also need a way to be part of the wider research output ecosystem. So we, Jenny and I ran a PR Voices project, the Practice Research Voices, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And so we're building on the last fully virtual plenary, P23, and also PIDFest in Prague, where we also had a lot of discussions around kind of the characterizations of these things. So if anyone recognizes this from South Park, we've had a birds of a feather. We are now in phase 2, and then phase 3 will be RDA interest group. So what we're going to do now is introductions. This will now be a less time consuming and therefore slightly more chatty than it was originally planned. So Andrew and Jill, can you just say hello on your mics just to make sure we can hear you in the room?
Hello.
Perfect.
Hello.
Perfect. And I will now check whether or not I'm pronouncing your name in any way correctly, Jill.
Should we maybe just get our people online? How about if we get each of you to introduce yourselves, like, and yeah.
Yeah.
So
When you don't have the microphone, you're barely understandable.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Normally I'm very loud, so I have to kind of try, but I will make sure I use the microphone
Oh,
properly.
we hear you, Adam. I think it's the other voices. So long as the other voices have
Hi,
the
sorry,
microphone.
is that better? I haven't, I now have the microphone. So I was just saying, if we start with our introductions online and get our Zoom colleagues to just give us some information about who you are, where you work, and why you're here today. So if we start with Andrew.
Hi, sorry, I'm a bit under the weather, but I'm Andrew Hoffman. I work at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I have a sort of hybrid function where I mostly do what we call support work in the area of research data management and related kinds of things. And I have a small chunk of FTEs that I also do research, but that's related to the support type stuff. I work in 2 different institutes in the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences. One is the Center for Science and Technology Studies, and the other is Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology. And I guess my reason for being here comes both, or at least initially, from anthropology, where there's a lot of multimodal ethnography, visual anthropology, ethnographic filmmaking, and this kind of thing. Where I've gotten questions about what do we do with this stuff, but also on the Center for Science and Technology Studies, also called CWTS side, there's sort of a general interest in thinking about how to innovate in scholarly publishing. So I come from both of those directions.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Now this is where I'm going to get marvelous. So Gilles, but I've probably got completely wrong. On to you next.
You are completely right. So I'm Gilles Oanessian. I'm working in CNRS, the French National Organization for Research nationwide. And I'm not involved in this field until now, but there is a national program starting on research with cultural and creative industries in France. We are going to look at the landscape of metadata, for instance. The program covers a very wide range of cultural and creative industries. That's performing arts, libraries, movie industry, book edition, fashion, many other fields. So music, audiovisual. So I'm curious to see what's going on in the field, mostly a listener and a beginner. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And final, I think we've got at least one more person possibly on there, or they both, no, they're all, okay. You're our two remote joiners. Marvelous. I'm going to hand the microphone now over to our two colleagues in the room to introduce themselves.
So, hi, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. My name is Betsaida. Well, I work here at the University of Costa Rica. I'm a physicist, so technically I'm doing a TA here and RA also. And yeah, I'm a physicist, but I'm also an artist, a plastic artist. And of course, I'm well aware about how to treat data that comes from my field, physics. But I was curious about how to treat these non-traditional outputs. So that's why I'm here.
Hello, I'm Pia Markkanen. I come from University of Oulu in Finland, and I'm the data steward in our technical faculty. And I work actually in the Oulu School of Architecture, which is part of our faculty. So the data that we produce and research that we do is quite different from the other units in our faculty. And I have been doing, I'm at the moment finalizing my PhD thesis on work environment research, and I have been doing participatory design studies and designed interventions into work environments, which have been then actually constructed over there. So what I have been doing is a quite different kind of work than what somebody does in the laboratory or something else. So this is why I'm in this session today, because it really interests me personally. So thank you for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I guess Adam and I should probably just explain why we're here and our interest in this work. So my name's Jenny. I work at the University of Westminster, based in London in the UK. I have been at Westminster now for 8 years, and I've been working primarily over the last few years. I've got a day job, which is very much around the university's research environment, scholarly publishing, repositories, but I've been leading work around capturing these creative and performing arts outputs, very much in collaboration and co-design with our creative arts, visual arts community at Westminster. So we developed, I led the development of a repository that captured these outputs, and we'll talk a little bit more about practice research in a minute and why we talk about it in that way. And really, we found some interesting work around how the open standards landscape doesn't work for this research, that every single university in the UK in particular does it each differently. So there's a lot of invested energy being put into doing things differently. And then all of this research is siloed because it doesn't actually interact very well with those open standards. So that then led on to a AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project to look at how our work at Westminster could scale nationally. So that's why I'm here. We'll talk a bit more about that work in a minute. That's really the foundations for our approaches. And then Adam and I have been working together for probably about four years now. Yeah. And so I'll hand over to Adam.
Okay, so I'm Adam. I work at JISC in the UK as my kind of like day job. I support the Orca Consortium. I work with persistent identifiers, both in a kind of like technical metadata space and in kind of the policy space. I have a guilty secret that I am also a hypertext poet and a multimodal artist creator. And I can't store or put any of my work anywhere. So I can stick it in other, which is, as we were at DataCite yesterday, is the 6th most popular resource type in DataCite for types of DOIs. But other than that, I can't really do anything about the way that I actually produce my work, the way that it's been created, and then put it into like the open global registries of these various different things, unless we do other. And we also talked yesterday about the fact that people use collections in lots of different ways and create buckets where they just put everything into. So these data sets, which may have one or more different kinds of resource in it, also don't necessarily properly capture or speak to the way that works are created. At the kind of like composition level, you end up doing a lot of process work, and that, again, that process you can't really capture anywhere. You end up with a kind of like what I call a terminal output. You have like a thing at the end, and there are some system platforms coming along which are starting to look at that, but again, none of them are standardized. None of them are, they're kind of like, here, let's capture this process. And that doesn't really help us. It just kind of is a way of writing stuff somewhere and then it being forgotten and locked away from everything else. It's the standard thing we say, I'm going to put this key somewhere safe, and that is the guaranteed magic incantation to lose it forever. So we'll talk a bit more now about what we did over the last couple of years. So this is like a brief session on kind of, not so brief now, kind of what we've done to kind of introduce that. And then if any of the 4 of you have, again, projects that are relevant, we're more than interested for you to spend a little bit of time on this too.
Okay, now back to me. So practice research might be, I think, more recognized in Finland as a concept, but I'm not sure. It depends. It's very creative, creative arts focused. So the reason often, and this is a global challenge, these outputs are seen as other. They're seen as non-traditional. They're seen as individual format-based items. So it's a video file, it's an audio file. There's no kind of respect around the context of what that output is. So this idea of, or this practice research lens, there are different flavors of practice research. And particularly in Europe, artistic research is the most well-known way of thinking about this research. And the research catalog is a very popular, well-known tool in that space. The benefit of looking at using this practice research lens is thinking much more about the method as being practice. Hopefully our online colleagues can still see our slides. If you just click on Zoom down the bottom, yeah. Cool, awesome, you're all still there, marvelous. These researchers create a wide range of outputs. They create text and non-text. So I think that's the other thing. It's not just making an assumption that all of the outputs these communities create are non-text. They do create text. That idea of process being as important as end product, and also that it represents the body of work that changes over time. So it's not just a single sole PDF output. That is one kind of output they create. The recognition of contributors is really important. So the idea of thinking about those videographers, those choreographers, those research data managers, those archivists, there's a load of different people who contribute. And going back to that idea of participatory research, participants are key contributors for some of these communities. So I already sort of said, takes us beyond the idea of non-traditional output. That's an add-on. Also, I think something that's really important, particularly in the UK anyway, is that this research is not always grant funded. So policies from funders and the associated funding is not always there to make this research more open. So our project, Practice Research Voices, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, really focused on the idea of an intersectional practice research community. So recognizing not only discipline domains such as music, drama, visual arts, but also domains. So when we talk about domains, we think about research data managers, we think about software engineers, we think about repository developers, librarians, archivists, records managers. So as well as communities like RDA, ORCIDs, DataCite, all of these communities have their own cultures. And that's interesting, but it's also challenging. Other findings, the need to capture and represent the narrative alongside output. So it's not just necessarily the file, but there is some contextual narrative needed. Preservation is a priority and a challenge. This work is not being captured well, it's not being preserved. When we started, there was a lot of questions around, well, we've got collection, that's good enough. However, we certainly have identified that the idea of portfolio, so portfolio is not just about collection, it's ordered items. Narrative is really important. Recognizing those types of contributors are fair, and the idea of sort of access and interoperability rather than making all of this work open. And that's very much, there's a lot of work being done around ethics, and when you're capturing participant data, you can't necessarily make all of that open. There's a real skills gap at the moment. There's a lot of different, going back to that intersectional community of practice, there's good practice and best practice in digital preservation, in libraries and research data, but they're all in different places. And really a need to work with existing and emerging community-backed open standards. In the UK particularly, every university has its own way of doing this, and all of this information is siloed. So our Westminster repository, we captured all of this really interesting work, but when you start to map it to ORCID, to DataCite, you know, there is some, it does work a little bit, but it still needs some work. And again, it's all assumed on it being a single output. So working with these existing and emerging community-backed open standards and open source software is really important. We were getting and actually thinking really about what happens to the data when it's in this repository. So making sure it's not siloed away in some page 4 database where you can't access what's going on with usage and citation. So we documented a metadata schema. And as a librarian, this still makes me very happy. I'm not sure I quite realized I'd get this involved in metadata, but there you go. So which identifies what maps and what needs work. Looked at the idea of artifact or concepts of artifact, event, collection, and portfolio. I think what's really interesting about some of the work, we've worked with colleagues at CoSector, based in London in the UK, is this idea of artifact is much more inclusive than thinking about data sets. And a data set can be an artifact and, you know, vice versa. But just thinking about language here, I think is really important. There are relevant existing and emerging standards. So it's not about creating yes, the metadata schema is a new one, but actually not trying to create lots of new standards. Working with the research activity identifier, the RAID, for example, to capture ongoing work is one example. Context needs to be embedded at individual output or object level and at that portfolio level. Contributorship, I've mentioned, provenance as well. I think some of the conversations happening about AI, we need to recognize and capture that provenance information, partly so we can, and Adam's probably better explaining this to me, but so we can actually track where that piece of data has come from and how it's been built on over time. So we did some surveys, some semi-structured interviews and a focus group. We reviewed the standards, we worked with community, and we did some platform testing with our institutional repository. So we have this beautiful schema, and there is a lovely QR code. You can go and look at the detail, well documented now, which is something we've only managed to do over the last 4 or 5 months. Yes.
Give me 1 second. Yeah. So... This is closing the chat right now. There. So the issue that we have is the schema is quite complicated. And the way that it's been exported in SVG, there are actually active things above and below. So it says we've got the schema's portfolio.
Can you point the mic in Adam's direction? I think that's
I was going to say, yeah, I think just what I'll do first, I think let's not get too bogged down in the detail. The QR code is really helpful because it takes you directly to the, does it take us to the poster or to the schema itself? Schema, okay, so that takes us to the schema itself. What we've got on the left of the screen is we've got the portfolio idea, so that portfolio grouping concepts together meaningfully in order. So we've got things like the identifier, titles, contributors, descriptions, context statements, that kind of information. And then the idea of narrative and context being captured at item level and at that higher portfolio level. So that flexible metadata structure, accommodating diverse content types, but integrating with existing systems and standards, and capturing and allowing for multiple contributor roles and relationships. So there's no good way, in all honesty, to display this on a screen. Apologies. Yeah. Can you hear Andrew? Can you hear Adam now with a secondary mic, or you're still not hearing him? For those of you
I
online.
did not hear him if he was just trying
Okay,
to talk.
that's fine. I will just give him this one.
So the thing to say about the schema is that we have a poster in the Minute Madness session. We're the first poster, and we'll be doing more of a job of going into some detail, both in the 60 seconds and afterwards. So this bit of the session, the best thing to do is to take the QR and look at that, and then we'll also link the poster in the online notes in the Google Doc. And then when it comes to discussion, we can talk more about either the schema or the way that the schema has been developed. Is that okay?
Okay, so opportunities for change. So current challenges, lack of standardization, I've mentioned that already, assumptions, and I think this is a really important point for me personally, about fitting in with the current scientific research landscape. So we have an opportunity to change this, and capture, yes, capture is happening, reuse, really not happening. So certainly the work we've done, and also I think there's a disconnect between rights and licensing. And so how do we respect the ownership of the original data owners and enable reuse in a way that's done in collaboration with those owners of the data. Capacity and sustainability, I think there's opportunities here because it is, I think my feeling is that research software engineers now have a much better recognition in this ecosystem, but actually what about those data stewards, those research data managers, those archivists, those librarians, but also certainly, again, in the UK, there's a lot of very small specialist universities and institutions carrying out this research, so they don't have the support at local level. So how can we look at that nationally to change that? And I think realizing now we've repeated a lot of what we already said, but those community-led open standards and systems and repositories are a really good place to capture this research, that contributorship recognition, and changing those research reward and recognition systems. And really this is about also reflecting a diverse range of knowledge and contributors so that actually that knowledge is reflected not only for return on investment for funders, but actually this research is there. And that has pros and cons. And I'm very aware that certainly one of our people we interviewed, an education researcher, was like, well, I'm happy with you capturing it for that reason, but if they're going to start using it to evaluate me, then that's a different story. So solutions and challenges, and really people is key here. So we've just talked a lot, and actually we need to bear in mind the time. I think we've finished at 11:30, don't we? So we've still got a bit more time. This is now a chance to hand back over to you as a group and ask you, I think some of you are quite new to this space, which is fine, but actually if you're not, or if you've got some ideas, are you doing anything, or are you aware of anything that's of interest and relates to this work? So I think that's it. We're very open to criticism and how we might change our approaches and embed new ways of thinking as well. So anyone, I guess, in the room first? Anyone, or you got any thoughts, or have you come across, how have you had to interact with some of these systems? Like, how have you been challenged?
I can comment from the researcher perspective, and having done this kind of a research by design research, it has proven, first of all, difficult to publish because the data is rich, and that requires combining some open science data to the research articles. So I think that these kinds of systems are very important so that we can, because we do quite a lot of participatory research, so we can implement what we learn from more scientific research into our environment in a way that is good for people. So this is why I consider this part very important, so that the research can then take that kind of an creative outputs, not necessarily as to study the who create them, but how people experience them, the wider audience in that way. What has been helpful for me is that I have created a certain kind of framework for my study that sort of when you consider a space, you can list every single object from here. But then again, you can also describe it to, for example, atmosphere or aesthetics or symbolic dimension, and that sort of it's by far not that very metadata kind of data, but it's a sort of route to that dimension, to that direction. So this is I'm just rambling here, but I hope it gives you something.
Have you got any thoughts? As no, just note that. So I'm not going to. How about our colleagues, our two colleagues online? Have you got any thoughts about what we've said so far and how you, but actually what you're coming across and insights to share, I guess?
As I said, I'm a newcomer in the field, and I'm not sure I really fully understood the width of the stuff you're considering or you have been considering already. So there is not much I can add at this stage. Sorry for that.
All good. No, I think that it's very hard to kind of compress 3 years work into a few slides. So I think some of that is just about, yeah, how much we're sharing. We're working on a journal article. We have published one already. So we will have more, and we can share some links to our project website and that kind of thing. But yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I think, Andrew, do you have any, thank you, Gilles, much appreciated.
Yeah.
Andrew, do you have any thoughts?
This is the hour that my family comes home, so sorry if you hear things in
Okay.
the background. Yeah, so as I said, my sort of main entree into this is through largely some of the anthropologists who I work with. We, I, without first reflecting on your very, what I think, nice summary of what you've done. Granted, I haven't read as much as I should have by now about what's happened in the PR Voices, but I found what you've just presented quite informative and succinct. So thanks for giving that high level overview. We have been thinking about a lot of the same things from various perspectives, right down to the, do I want to be evaluated based on this? Maybe that's even first and foremost among some of the concerns with the anthropologists who I work with. The anthropology department at Leiden historically is actually quite contra research data management and anything that reeks of additional bureaucracy or audit culture, as they like to frame it. So they're an interesting group to work with. But what I've sort of been able to do over the past couple of years through these ongoing conversations is convince them that they're talking about a lot of what is being talked about in the sort of more orthodox research data management and open science space. And that led us to a small project that we got 10,000 euros of funding from our university for a project we've tentatively called Community, what's Karma? Community Archive for Multimodal and Artistic Research. We're kicking off in February, so I think a lot of what you've done is going to be very instructive in thinking about what the possibilities are for what we're doing. It's just a university-based grant, but already I think we have ideas about bringing in national infrastructure providers, for example, again, along the lines of what you've pointed out, you know, what can you sort of shoehorn into existing infrastructure versus what needs to be built out de novo based on whatever the use cases are. So I would say that's the sort of most relevant thing that I have to contribute in terms of what's happening on our end. We also had our National Open Science Festival last week. No, sorry, 3 weeks ago. I've lost track of time. And I had a small 45-minute workshop on non-traditional research outputs that was also kind of intending to take the temperature of who shows up at these national open science festivals, and what kinds of use cases they bring or not. And it was quite interesting because I was very specific in how I worded this workshop, that we were especially looking for use cases from the arts, humanities, social sciences, and even sort of practice or research from the universities of applied sciences. And, you know, of 6 tables, only 2 really had use cases that kind of map onto the kinds of things that we're talking about. And even still, those were quite a bit further afield, you know, podcasts, for example, not necessarily coming out of process-based work. So, you know, that's also interesting to understand who is showing up in these spaces and who's not, and how we can actually get to the folks who are working in these spaces, such as what you've talked about in PR Voices, but who don't contribute or don't see themselves in RDA, for example. Sorry, that was also a bit of blabbing, but hopefully that brings you up to speed on what we, and mostly me in collaboration with a few of my researchers at Leiden, have been thinking about for the past year or so.
No, that's amazing. Thank you, Andrew. That's and yeah, I feel like we've definitely I've heard about a bit of work. I think actually what's really interesting, thinking about the Netherlands, my academic collaborator was involved in some work there recently, and the only thing that was considered was journal articles and possibly monographs. And so I think it's just really interesting that it's just all of this really rich, diverse knowledge is just being left out of bids of the conversation, really. And I think that certainly in the UK, arts and humanities departments are at risk. They're being closed. There's just not enough data in the system that reflects the research they're doing. So there is a fine line here, but I would argue visibility is.
So just a couple of things from the last session that we ran in plenary 22. One was the participatory research. There was someone else talking about participatory research, and they were saying the same thing. It was difficult to capture. So sorry. And the funder at the end said, we need a PDF of something in order to sign off your funding. And that was how they captured their outputs. Oh dear. And then the other thing to say is around about this idea about sustainability. And we have the kind of balance between the pragmatic implementation of things due to projects and the need for sustainability and longer term kind of changing in standards in the actual landscape. And I think that's something that we've all found as we work on things, is that we can do a little bit, but to actually move that from something that we work on or something that's funded by a project to something that's a service and sustainable is, you know, more and more of an issue. And I think the final thing is that some of the people we work with say, well, we don't have any data. We don't have that data. No, we don't have data. I do have 2 terabytes of recordings of performances and rehearsals, but I don't have any data. And I think that some of the just like language around this thing, so that's one of the reasons that we talk about artifacts, is, you know, it is sometimes talking to the researchers themselves. We don't use a repository. We don't have any data. I do have 2 terabytes stored in a large online system, but that online system would definitely not be a repository, you know.
Yes, and I think that idea of where this research is currently captured, it's currently captured not in repositories, it's captured in commercial platforms, because and in websites. I mean, oh my goodness, like the websites that my team deal with, and the issues with that long-term sustainability, it's dead, it's gone, it's lost. And actually I think there's a very interesting kind of question here, and I think one of the challenges about this session being so early on the program is our hopefully our poster session this afternoon we can gather some more people together, because I think it's really, I feel like the community in this session today is very new to RDA. I mean, is this your first RDA? And online, is this your first RDA conference?
I was in Göteborg.
Okay, cool.
It's my 6th or 7th.
Okay, interesting, cool. So I think I personally, this is probably my second, maybe third in person, but I still feel on the fringes. And I think this work is still very much on the fringes. And what we want to build with the interest group is how do we get this into the mainstream of RDA? And I think this is a really positive starting point.
Can I comment? Can I comment
sure.
on that actually? There was a working group for like historical and social methods or something to this effect that was begun several years ago. My understanding is that it was begun by folks from the US who are kind of around what's called the Platform for Experimental Collaborative Ethnography, or PEACE, PECE. Are you familiar with this? Does that ring a bell to anybody in the room?
So I'm familiar with some of the work from the working group, but again, the issue that we've been talking about, I'm co-chair for another project as well, is about that ongoing sustainability and update. So I think they ceased as a working group and didn't move to an IG. So that was 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, and my point in bringing this up was actually because my sense is that they may have struggled a bit with bringing some of what they were dealing with into the kind of mainstream of RDA. Now, I think some of the conversations that you're having here are of a different nature than I think some of the conversations they were having. However, I'm in close touch with those folks, and I think they might actually have some interesting insights in terms of their experiences and some of the challenges that they face, bringing some of the perspectives that we're talking about today and keeping them a sustainable part of the conversation within the wider international.
That would be great. And that is what, sorry, for the previous slide, Jenny. That is one of the things that we're trying to think about and trying to capture now as we move towards the actual statement of work for the interest group, is to try and think about who can we pick up from the previous working groups. And so for the people who haven't been to RDA before, there are two kinds of things that happen in the RDA. There's the working groups which have an objective and a time. So they generally are 18 or 24 months. And they have a set of outputs, and they have outputs, and those outputs at the end of it are the end of the working group. And there are interest groups, which are kind of a long-term thing that keeps a watchful eye and may also produce outputs, or may actually also produce working groups. But they are kind of like an overall kind of like RDA. This is the place where we discuss these kind of things. And one of the things that we did at our last session was discuss whether or not this kind of work would be better suited to a working group and this kind of area, or an interest group. And we have decided, as you can see from the title of the thing, that an interest group is better because we need some time to gather, to gain a little bit of momentum and community before we decide what work and what outputs actually need to be. So again, from the things that we've already said in the room today about where we are and what we're doing, you can see that we probably need a little bit of time to kind of collate and collect and think about what the most useful kind of first, second, third things are, both to look at and bring together, but then also to kind of focus on as ways that we can produce and raise all like various research outputs by the different things that we have. I think that maybe also answers some of your knowledge and recollections from that other working group, Andrew, because I think, yeah, it's part of the thing that we were really looking at whenever we discussed working group versus interest group, was about gaining that traction inside RDA for the things that are being discussed.
Okay, this was just also, I think we've heard some examples already, but just to highlight, we're very aware that there is some aligned work going on that's different but related. Certainly, part of my team's remit is open access publishing, and I'm responsible for our University of Westminster Press, and University of Michigan is our publishing partner, so we're very aware of the work that they're doing with the Fulcrum platform. We've got funding from Open Book Futures in the UK to publish an experimental monograph, so thinking about how this work sort of fits within the publishing landscape as well as the work going on in the repositories landscape. Australia's got some very good guidance now around fair and open non-traditional research outputs, but I think, you know, our vision certainly is around moving away from this research being non-something and other, and bringing this research into the mainstream. And I think we've touched on this a bit with the participatory research, but this practice research happens across all disciplines. It's not just something that primarily happens in the creative arts and performing arts. It happens in health, it happens in social work, in nursing, in education. So this work is relevant to other disciplines as well. Certainly there's a lot of work going on in the UK around research culture and recognising the way the research is done and who's carrying it out and recognising that contribution. So it's very relevant to that space as well. So I've proposed milestone. I think this is a starting point to, well, it's a starting point to get to an information group or an interest group. Sorry, I still can't get my head around the acronyms at RDA. So today is the birds of a feather session. I think and we will talk. We've got some more discussion points to do next, but very much this morning session as a starting point. I think it certainly got me thinking about how we can use our poster 1 minute we have this afternoon to highlight some of what's come out of this session this morning and try and get some more discussion going on while we're here at RDA. And this is really just what would need to happen to get to that first interest group meeting at the next face-to-face plenary next year, which we realise not everyone can make. What I have realised is the virtual plenaries are really difficult to make things work because of the time zones. You never quite seem to get it right. And there's always another session that's conflicting. So it might be that we need to take the conversation out of RDA and try and get some consensus about a meeting in the next couple of weeks online to take this forward, I think. I think that's all I needed to say about that slide. But our breakouts will be a collective one, we think. And we totally well behind time now. Is it worth, because I think my sense of who's in the session, is it worth bringing this together and maybe just talking generally? But Adam, I'm going to hand this back over to you to think about.
So fundamentally, there's two ways we can run this. We can either, because I have my headphones and everything with me, we could either run one online breakout and one in-person breakout, or we can run a breakout, which isn't a breakout, which is just discussion around these topics. And I think my sense is that it is probably better to run one bit where we just run through all of this rather than having to do that. And that'll also maybe give us a better thing. But I think that's something that especially the online people would need to feed back into. So I know whenever I've been the online participant in a hybrid session, it can be sometimes a little bit more difficult to contribute. We've got a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people here, so I don't think that will hopefully be much of an issue. But again, hands up or hands up reacts if we think we can do one thing where we kind of like run through this. We don't really need to, I think, to do group introductions or anything like that, so that's 5 minutes gone as well. And the basic plan was to look at how and where we are on standards and technical work around this, how and where we are on community and training, and then review the draft statement of work, which is in the Google Doc. And what I will do next is make sure that everyone has a link to the Google Doc.
I'm thinking also, just because we're quite in the detail, Adam and I, because we've been working on this, and as a group, you're newer to this. Is it maybe more asking you what would be helpful and how we can engage with your communities, where there are other, sorry, I'm going to look this way at the camera for a bit. Hello, sorry, I keep forgetting you're that way. How we can get, how can we can best represent you, and how we can, I guess, get hold of you really, because I think we can, and if people want to, we can get stuck straight into metadata schema and we can talk more about the schema we've developed. And about the persistent identifiers we've looked at, but I worry that particularly if you're new to this space, that might be unhelpful. So any thoughts, firstly online, about what would be helpful for you as much as anything? Having absolute no response online, so we're just
I always talk a lot in meetings, so I try not to be the first out of the gate because sometimes it never ends.
I feel the same, Andrew. There's 6 people here. Just talk.
over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, again, I I think despite my temporal exposure to this, I've been around it longer than maybe it seems. So I have maybe different considerations than the other folks in the room and online in terms of what could be useful here. But for me, the first thing that comes to mind is if we are talking about standards and technical stuff, the question becomes like where do we envision these things being implemented, for example, at what level? And maybe folks in the room know a bit about their own repositories or whatever that they're using and what they envision to be some of the struggles with bringing the very nice work that you've done to the University of Leiden's repository and say, hey, can we use this or something? Yeah, just a way of bridging between what we might know about and maybe know less about. But that could also be a terrible idea or make no sense. That's okay. It's late. And
I think it's interesting because I think we've got kind of technical domainy people and we've got researchers here as well. So I guess actually I'm going to hand it back over to our 2 researchers in the room and see if they've got any thoughts about what would be useful.
Well, I really want to know more about guidelines for documentation. I mean, like in visual arts, like how to documentate like the painting process, or yeah, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would also be very useful to set up some sort of a guideline, how you can do things and consider it from different methodological perspective, whether it's something visual or something documented otherwise. I would love to sort of go through the repository, what there is to get hang of things, because I haven't been that open science practitioner concerning my own research yet, because I have tried to learn. And also what I consider important is to draft some guidelines for when you are starting some kind of an creative project that you want to also use as a research project, what you need to consider when you collaborate with other people, so you get the all those data privacy issues right in from the get-go, and not when you really want to publish something and have it open access and then you realize that you cannot do it. So that is one of the key issues here. But I would love to continue thinking about these things. So.
Fantastic. And I think actually for me, I up until recently, my remit included research ethics and integrity. And so in the university, and so for me, it's almost a flavor of data management planning as part of this conversation. And actually it's about respecting the fact that it's often practice is how a researcher generates a living. So they're often on fractional contracts. So you can't just assume that their entire world is about creating research. Also, there's some interesting work around when or conversations anyway with our discipline colleagues about when something moves from simply being practice to being practice research. So when is it research? And so actually how we, it might just be a practice research lens on data management planning, for example, or so I think we certainly had a session at Page Best Persistent Identifiers in festival in Prague over the summer, the northern summer, and we talked about skills and how libraries are really good communities, and particularly in the US, for kind of building some of those skills. I think we need to be careful though, expecting our discipline colleagues to do all of the work. And I think you don't expect a discipline academic to necessarily be a software engineer, although some are. So we shouldn't be asking our researchers, our discipline people, to be doing all of the work. So how can we harness the skills and expertise? And I think that's what's really interesting about this work, is there's some metadata open standards work, which is very much an RDA focus. And then there's the skills and the the knowledge building and the how do we get the word out and what are the basics, because I've worked across most of these roles now: repositories, open access, research data management, digital preservation, and so there is guidance out there, and certainly what we're trying to do is get funding to spend the time to build some of this this information, but ongoing funding, and I think that's the challenge in this space, is the project funding means that something happens, going back to the RDA groups, and then it sort of stops because the funding runs out. Hopefully I've given Adam some time to think too. I feel like we've got still a bit of a mix.
Yeah, I've got the microphone again, and now it will never leave. So I think we've got a few different things that we need to talk about here. That's kind of like a general outline of, like, we can spend 4 or 5 minutes. Andrew, you've got your hand up. I've just translated the Spanish. Yes. You're on mute.
I do, but please go ahead with your unless you had a next contribution, but I can wait.
No, I was going to say the things we've got in the notes session now are potentially things we could just spend a couple of minutes on each discussing. We've just kind of identified them as areas and objects, but I wonder if there's something else from either yourself or from Gilles, and otherwise.
Yeah, I have maybe 2 more thoughts that
Yep.
based on what you all presented on. One, research catalog came up, so I think that this is possibly an interesting thing to talk a bit about. And the other is RAID and what that looks like in this setting.
Yeah, I think yes, the research catalog. I remember the other thing I wanted to say from our initial discussions was about this idea about collections and portfolios. And I always tell people the really simple image I have in my head is that a collection's a bucket that you chuck stuff into, and then you dip your hand in and you're never quite sure what you're getting. And portfolio is more kind of like a washing line. It's more kind of like an organized thing that you can understand the structure and narrative. And so, for example, if you talk about things like RowCrate, which is from EOSC, and Research Object / or the RAID persistent identifier, which is coming from ARDC, but it's becoming more global now. They have the ability to have like timestamp things related to other things, and again, these kind of context and narrative. And one of the things that I was talking about yesterday in data science, sorry for I'm slightly rambling, but I think it's kind of a thing that we might want to talk about, is this idea that we need to start having better provenance, ownership, attribution in our metadata, as well as just kind of like authors. These contributor pieces are really important, because as we build more complex objects, as we build research outputs, which are, here are the people involved, here is some of the funding that we had, here are some of the data that we produced, here are some of the other artifacts, and link all those things. That kind of combined object, which is here is a project, we want to be able to surface all the different kinds of contribution, all the different kinds of funding, and so on. And we also want to be able to track back where those things came from. So that provenance, as well as those attributions and contributorships, are all really important from the point of view of giving credit to people. And that's one of the reasons I slightly disagreed with Mark on his keynote about why researchers were producing less open data. They're producing less open data because they're becoming more aware that they're not getting credit for it when it's reused. And one of the things that we're seeing now is more of awareness in research culture about the fact that you're depositing something in an open repository, you're creating these artifacts, and you're putting a lot of time into it, and then someone else is using it and getting a Nobel Prize. And, you know, in the most extreme end, there are people who contributed to PDB 10, 15 years ago who did an absolute huge amount of work to create those structures. None of that is, you know, credited or valorized, because that link back to the original work is not there in both the models that are produced and the way that it's talked about and discussed. So my kind of other thing is kind of like provenance and attribution. So that's the thing. But yeah, okay, so I think
I was just going to pick up the research catalog for a minute. We certainly worked with one of the team. We had one of the team from the research catalog, or from that community, on our community advisory group through PR Voices, and I think they are different approaches. We have certainly, before we developed our Westminster repository, we looked at the research catalogue, and the research catalogue is an amazing platform. It's very complex, and it works in a particular way. So you work with that space. I think certainly what we're doing is different in our standards-based approach here, because the danger is all of these platforms just capture all this stuff, and then they're not actually well discovered because they don't have that interoperability with standards. So I think the research catalogue is doing a different kind of complementary thing, but it's not once it's in there, like, yes, you can find it, but it's kind of stuck there. And that's the problem with a lot, even, you know, our own repository at the moment, because it's not working well enough with standards. You put it there, and, you know, if you know it's there, you can find it. I've certainly tried to have a play with the research catalogue, and it's quite a high level of I guess skill to work with that. And it's more about, it's one view, I guess, about how we do this, but it's certainly a community that we have members of our team who are members of Society for Artistic Research, and so we're working with them. I must also confess, when it comes to the research catalogue, I leave that to my discipline colleagues to contribute, and then I try and simplify it into something I can understand. But we started talking about exogenesis and a variety of more, I guess, theoretical approaches, which is important, but we sort of sit more with that sharing and the open standards piece, and the discipline community continues to talk about this. I think what's tricky is that you can get very bogged down in very theoretical conversations, and that's fine, and that's great, and that's useful. But I don't know, Andrew, you may know more about the research catalogue than I do, in all honesty. So I don't know if you've got any other comments around that in particular.
I actually don't know a ton about it, except that this small grant that we've gotten is through this, or in collaboration with this interfaculty group called the Recenter, which includes researchers both from my faculty, social sciences, social and behavioral sciences, as well as from humanities. And I guess the founders of research catalog are quite close to some of the folks in the humanities faculty, and so they're at our kind of pre-kickoff a couple of weeks ago, there was some discussion about reaching out to them and seeing if they want to are on board with what we're doing, with the acknowledgement again that they're not sort of standards driven. But I think your point brings up maybe like one of the constitutive tensions that we confront working in this space, is that as you call the discipline folks, really do tend to get bogged down in these sort of theoretical conversations, and the standards folks want to kind of make the standard and move on, but without moving on, without the people who haven't yet finished their theoretical conversations, you I think threaten to put a lot of good work to, if not waste, then at least to minimum uptake. And again, that's something that I see in my day-to-day work. I'm trained as an ethnographer, and I kind of became a data steward by accident. So, you know, I tend to see also the world through the lens of people who do enjoy having long, protracted, bogged down theoretical conversations about all this stuff. And but I also recognize that you can't have it forever. So finding that point of agreeing and moving on and doing something more productive than that is an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, and I think something really important about the research catalogue is it does respect the form and function in a way that the average repository doesn't at the moment. And I think that's really important to remember. And we've not really said much about the repository element of our work today, because it's not really been the priority. But certainly the portfolios we've published, you know, they look a bit more like a website, and they, you know, they do have images, and the future version of a practice research repository would have that kind of interactive video, audio, image kind of space. So it's much more interactive, which is certainly a real strength of the research catalogue. It's much more interactive.
I mean, was that something that you didn't really want to touch with a 10-foot pole in terms of mappings, or did you have a sense that the folks at RC were not really on board with thinking of what that could look like in the future, or is that too many political discussions to have in such a short period of time? We can have a coffee on Zoom another time if that's
maybe. I think there's a bit of a difference in philosophical approaches, is probably how I'd put it. And I think it's really helped, like we need to continue conversations, but I think they are primarily two different approaches to this space. And that's, and also the sustainability piece. We haven't really talked much about that today, but getting this data into open standards and open repositories means that you're not reliant on one specific piece of software continuing to work and be online. And I think that's why we talk so much about open standards, open source repository software going forward. Is you've got that, once you've got this work into that wider ecosystem, then you're less likely to lose it. Whereas if you're reliant on one platform being funded forever and you're not getting that data out there, then it's more likely to be lost in the long term. I'm not saying that there's any risk of that happening anytime soon with the research catalog, but it is a question we think about a lot.
I think the prime example of a house built on sand is the amount of infrastructure that references Google Scholar, which is run by one person at Alphabet. And as soon as they retire, Alphabet have made it really clear it's going to be closed. And there are things like OpenAlex and other resources where there is like more of an sustainability. I don't know how many of you've heard of the principles of open standard infrastructure. So the POSI principles, which a couple of years ago came out, and various things like Crossref and DataCite and some of the other like larger national and international repositories have been discussing about, because those sorry, I'm up here now. So those POSI principles talk a lot about the fact that the things in them are sustainable. And they talk about the fact that one of the things that they need to be is like both openly governed and have data. There you go. So that's POSI on our screen, but it is not in Zoom because it's. Don't worry, we'll sort it out in a minute. We'll stick the URL in the chat. And so the thing that POSI does is it kind of evaluates how kind of like long-term this infrastructure is. And I think one of the things that, again, as we talk about kind of this kind of pragmatic start to things, what we're not then seeing is how much of it we can move. There's a I don't know if people know XKCD, but say a guy who is both scientist and engineer and also a cartoonist. And he has an amazing cartoon which is loads and loads of things, all stuck to which is, the whole kind of open infrastructure. And then right at the bottom, there's a little tiny thing that it all rests on top of, which is one person's project maintained on a part-time basis for that. And that's kind of a lot of what happens, especially in this kind of space where we're trying to develop new things and we're trying to like move with the standards. So one of the things that you'll see in the PR Voices reports is the large kind of community of engagement that we've set up. Again, we covered that already, but about working with Crossref, about working with ORCID, about working with DataCite, about the schemas that we produce largely being based on the existing schemas, and then some bits on the end which we say, well, you guys don't do this now, so we will talk to your research output ties, we'll talk to the actual kind of guys behind the schema about how we move this into the space, because that mapping is really important. We can start to develop these principles and these sustainable, that's the one. We can start to develop these, thank you. Yeah, and then there's also 927, of course, which is the most important of all of these. So XKCD 97, which is the one that we need one unifying standards. We have 15, we need one. And the next panel is we have 16 standards. And I think that's one of the things we have to be really careful about. That is, again, why we need to work in a way that moves these, 97, mate. We need to move these in a way from the work that we do that's very focused as a direct kind of interface onto our research, our practice, and our platforms to the more wider global standard space. And I think that kind of intersection is something that gives us sustainability, gives us those kind of like ways to develop, and also, helps all of research. This is where I get all kind of like dewy-eyed, and you know, the rising tide raises all boats. And if we actually do the things that we're talking about here on like provenance, on capturing process and capturing practice, that is stuff that whenever I was a molecular biologist, I did. That is stuff that whenever I was creating effective, metacognitive, adaptive, hypertext software, that's stuff that I did as well. But again, I couldn't capture. And I didn't see it as a valuable research output because there wasn't anywhere to capture it, there wasn't anywhere to valorize it. You know, there's no kind of, you don't get your credit for it. You don't, you know, when you go, and I think, Andrew, you raised that point about, you know, are we going to be evaluated on these things? And well, if it's done really badly, I would hope not, because you can't really then see it. You know, you don't get the credit for it. But if we do it well, if it becomes a part of the system, then absolutely a lot more of the work that we do that is both direct research and part of developing the process and practice for research becomes more visible, becomes something that we can get both credit for and becomes part of our kind of career as well. You know, and this is, you know, as someone who's got ADHD and has moved around a lot, I think that's really important to be able to say, I've done all of these different things, but they're all kind of like connected by process and practice. Okay, and that's me talking a lot. So I'm just going to look at the board. Jenny, I'm wondering if we want to see if anyone's going to cover any of those other things in the discussion session, and then we'll move on to the draft statement at work. So in the room or online, if there's anything of those list of things that we are talking about, the session's being recorded. I'm just going to look at the back now. The session's being recorded. Yep, so we'll not worry too much about taking detailed notes. We'll go back to the transcript for that. But if there's any, got 3 minutes. Gosh. Okay, in that case, I'll move on to the next bit. Okay. Yeah, we did start a little bit late. Okay. So, on a complete show of hands, who's interested in becoming more involved in this interest group? Andrew's run away, so that's a terrible start. Beer, great.
I smelled dinner, so I told my wife I'm coming shortly, eventually.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So you just missed a question. Who's interested in becoming a member and or co-chair? We'll come into that in a minute, but being more involved in this working group, interest group. Perfect, thank you.
Can discuss later? I was just saying that I'm interested, but maybe we can discuss it later. So I just repeated on.
Yeah, and I think actually right now what we need to focus on is just who is interested and not put any pressure on people about chairs and co-chairs and this, that, and the other. I think we're mindful that we are at RDA in person, but we can just garner the troops, get people together and get some kind of mailing list together or something so that we can continue on after the conference. And, you know, we'll be around and talking. We've got a poster, so we'll be there as well. But yeah, so I think that I guess for those of you online, hopefully, it sounds like Andrew's interested. Gilles, any thoughts from you? Is it something you'd like to kind of continue to be involved in conversations? Is it a bit too detailed right now? Okay, no, fair enough. Just seeing your notes, thanks. I think if you do have come across people in your work, it's really interesting to hear that something's going on in France, and we'd certainly be interested in continuing that kind of connection so that we can make sure our work's connected. That'd be really, really helpful because we're trying to understand where else there might be some interest.
One of the most helpful things is we kind of need to think about what this intergroup is about. And so I've highlighted the 2 different current potential names for it. And what I'd really like is other people's views on whether or not those are the right things, whether or not we need to either include something or because that kind of name of the interest group then shapes both people's connection with it and the kind of like direction that it takes. So I've kind of either talked about it as the non-traditional research outputs interest group or data for creative and practice research. Now the second one is because, again, obviously Jenny and I are focusing on this at the moment, but obviously both the sessions that we've run, we've had people very interested in participatory research, We've had people talk about the different kinds of like outputs and stuff. So I'm not sure, I have to be very careful with the mic. I'm not sure this is necessarily the best name for an interest group. And the only real issue I have with this is, as Jenny's already said, we don't really want to be keeping that kind of non-traditional characterization of these research outputs, because one of the things that's really important is that they don't continue to be seen as non-traditional. They become part of an equitable landscape. So again, any kind of thoughts on the kind of like name or the kind of focus or the field of how we express this would be really appreciated.
Sorry to jump in. I have a couple of thoughts in terms of just terminology, right? We're talking about output. Data could be input or output, but data I think isn't, important here. And by talking about outputs, we might actually be forgetting nominally about data that is not itself an output. I also maybe want to, I think part of how you're framing this is like a branding thing, right? I wonder how many more people are going to show up to RDA besides the people in this room and the few people that we know who might otherwise show up in other settings, and whether we should name based on trying to get people to identify, or actually, I often think it's better just admitting that you're not going to get a lot of the people who you actually need in the room, and then focus instead on how to engage those communities in a more meaningful way, knowing that they're simply not going to show up to RDA. That's a more meta thing, but I think it's something to consider in terms of what we expect out of this group, which brings to the third thing about, creative and practice research versus some more all-encompassing, non-traditional. At the workshop that I gave at our national science, open science thing, people ended up talking about the outcome of one table was, oh, we need a policy for samples, right? Not what I had envisioned going in, not what y'all are talking about in PR Voices, but that's something that resonated as being non-traditional for those people. Is that who we want in the room? Yes or no, doesn't matter. It's just a matter of what we expect to do. So is the idea then to have a kind of more all-encompassing, non-traditional research outputs or whatever that may also include things like samples, and then think about having subgroups so that those who are interested in creative and practice research have a place, but also those who have an interest in samples, that's probably more people at RDA than who are working with artistic research. They also might have a space to talk about that kind of thing. So it's just a matter of how you want to slice it and organize it, and what can you accommodate based on your vision for the organization.
No, that's really helpful, Andrew. And I think actually what this is all saying to me is there are a few people here at RDA who are interested and have done relevant work that we can just never get them to turn up to a session because there's something more relevant and interesting to them. This is never the top priority. And so perhaps what we need to do here is to talk to a few people about their thoughts. I think my anxiety around being too broad here, I think actually non-traditional is too broad, because this is one flavor of non-traditional research outputs. And actually, if we start going down the path of samples, I feel like we're going to get drawn back into science very quickly rather than.
Yeah, I think especially, so samples, absolutely. But also, yeah, I've been told about time as well, but also then IGSN and things like that. But do you have a, because I think you, as one of the other people in the other kind of spheres.
I was in Urban Transitions Conference last week, and lots of scientific data. But the reality is that we need the practice-based research to bring them into our lives, into our environment. So I think that the creative and performance arts was a kind of that drove my point. But to sort of bring it to maybe to the next level, it has to be something that is also considered as something, not something nice extra in our lives, which is important, but also maybe bring up the design, perhaps, to the name that draws a lot of people who already are in the research as well.
Okay, I've been told that we're quite over time, and so I'm going to go back to the one that is slides. It does anything. Okay, here we go. And I'm going to go down a little bit down here. So you can see that. So just to to point out for those of you who are new to RDA, one of the way that the groups work is that they have co-chairs who kind of like lead the work, and then there are members of the group who participate. Okay, and so at the moment, we currently have myself and Jenny down as people who are going to be co-chairs and leading, and obviously we'd be really interested if people could think about how and how much they can engage with this, as it were. So I'm going to do that. And then our last slide is thank you. And we really appreciate everyone that's come. We appreciate the participation. We will work on both moving the recording and making more detailed notes, and also making sure that those resources and things become available. So thank you all very much, and the end.